So when you think of Jim Morrison, what comes to mind? Probably Paris, right? Or the Sunset Strip in LA. But the real battle for his soul, the one that really forged his legend, that was fought somewhere totally different. Florida. This is the story of Jim Morrison's war with his own home state, and it's a wild one.
But first, you gotta hear this story. So it's July 3rd, 1971. Jim Morrison is found unconscious, rushed to the hospital, and pronounced dead. But then, get this, a miracle happens. After 18 hours, they bring him back to life. He sets a world record. He goes on to get married, have kids, release more music, and even direct Oscar-winning films before he finally passes away at 54.
It's an incredible tale, right? And it is completely 100% false. Yeah, that whole version of his life comes from a fan-made alternative history wiki. It's pure make-believe.
But that begs a really interesting question. Why? Why do we feel this need to invent new endings for him?
Well, I think the answer is buried in the real story, which, believe it or not, is way messier and a whole lot more dramatic than any fan fiction you could cook up. And that story is rooted deep in Florida.
So, to really understand the myth, we have to dig into the reality, and it involves a different kind of death. Not a physical one, but the slow, very public dismantling of a cultural icon.
You see, there are really two Jim Morrisons. There's the one we all know, right? The Lizard King, leather pants, shaman of rock and roll. But then there's this other Jim Morrison, the son of a Navy officer, a clean-cut college kid, and that Jim Morrison was a Florida boy, through and through.
To really get this whole conflict, we have to go back to the beginning. Before the doors, before all the fame and the chaos, there was just Jim, the Florida boy.
He was born in Melbourne, Florida, back in 1943. Now, his dad was a career naval officer, so the family moved around a lot, but Florida was always kind of home base. He went to St. Petersburg College, and then, and this is key, he went to Florida State University up in Tallahassee from 1962 to 1964. For decades, this whole period of his life was basically just a footnote. But then, a state archivist was digging through some old films and, just stumbled upon a ghost, the earliest known video footage of Jim Morrison ever found. And while this footage just perfectly shows the contrast, here he is 20 years old, wearing a jacket and tie, and he's earnestly playing a rejected student in a university recruitment film. His line? "How come my parents at the state of the university didn't look ahead?" It is so jarring to hear that almost naive delivery, knowing the man he was about to become just a few years later. Okay, now let's fast forward 5 years from that film. Morrison comes back to Florida, not as a student, but as an absolute rock god. And on March 1st, 1969, at the Dinner Key Auditorium in Miami, right in the middle of America's culture wars, everything just exploded. The concert is legendary. Really, for one big question. Did he or didn't he expose himself on stage? The accounts from people who were there are all over the place. One eyewitness, Jim Hayek, was absolutely certain he saw it. But then you talk to someone else who was there, Steve Boyer, and he remembers it totally differently. He saw something, sure, but it wasn't what everyone started claiming later. And then there's this third, even wilder theory from Adore's insider Danny Sugerman. He believed Morrison, the shaman, did it on purpose. He created this ambiguous moment. He told the crowd what he was doing, and in all the chaos, thousands of people thought they saw something that never actually happened, like a mass hypnosis. So, with all of this conflicting testimony, what do we actually know for sure? Well, the undisputed facts are this. Morrison was late, and he was very, very drunk. The venue was a converted airplane hangar, it was dangerously oversold, and it was ridiculously hot inside. And this is the big one. Of more than 100 photos that were entered as evidence at his trial, not a single one actually shows the exposure. Not one. But here's the thing. What people thought they saw, that was enough. For the establishment, who were already pretty freaked out by the counterculture, this was the perfect excuse. The state of Florida decided to make an example out of him. The rebel poet was about to become a criminal defendant. And this was the result. The mugshot from his trial, taken a year and a half after the concert. The defiant Lizard King is gone. He's been replaced by this weary, bearded man, just facing the full weight of the state machine. The trial itself was a total media circus, and in the end, he was actually acquitted of the main felony charge. But he was found guilty on 2 misdemeanors, indecent exposure and open profanity. The sentence was 6 months in jail and a $500 fine, and he was in the middle of appealing that exact conviction when he died in Paris.
Now, for almost 40 years, that was it. That was the end of Jim Morrison's official Florida story, a convicted criminal. But then, decades after his death, one final, completely surreal chapter was written.
Just think about how long this whole saga played out. You have the incident itself back in '69, then the conviction in 1970, and after that, just silence for 40 years, until the state of Florida decided to officially reopen the case.
So in 2010, the governor of Florida, Charlie Crist, who happened to be both a Doors fan and a fellow FSU alum, he decided to push for a posthumous pardon. He basically argued the evidence was super flimsy and that the conviction was a blot on the record of one of Florida's most famous sons. And on December 9, 2010, the Clemency Board voted unanimously to pardon Jim Morrison.
Okay, so let's bring it all the way back around to where we started. That pardon officially closed the book on Morrison's war with Florida. But it doesn't really answer our first question, does it? Why do we feel the need to invent stories about him being brought back from the dead?
Well, maybe it's because the real story is just too complicated, too messy to accept. You have a clean-cut Florida kid who becomes this poetic rebel only to get ground down by the very state that made him, and then forgiven 40 years too late. It's just a strange, tragic, and ultimately unresolved story, which kind of leaves us with one last thought. When it comes to our biggest cultural icons, is the messy, complicated truth ever really enough for us?